Need to repeat all of that, do I? No. Okay. Very warm welcome to everyone who's here, particularly the members of the Deliberations panel and staff, and we don't have any members of the public here as yet. And a very warm welcome to the media who are here with us today. Good to have you here, and in fact you're showing a lot of interest in this key issue for us. I'm obligated to read a statement, read public recording. I advise members that this is a public meeting and is being recorded. The Zoom recording will be made available on the Bay of Plenty Regional Council website following the meeting and archived for a period of 3 years. To any members of the public that are here today, and I don't note any at this point, all care will be taken to maintain your privacy. However, as a visitor in the public gallery, your presence may be recorded. By remaining in the public gallery, it is understood your consent is given if your image is inadvertently broadcast. I also remind all present that local government decision-making affords no protection to councillors, councillor officers and the public for comments made during meetings that are subsequently challenged in the court of law and determined to be slanderous. I will now call for any apologies. Are there any apologies? There are none. Moving on. There's no public forum today. There are no late items on the agenda. Just pause for 1 moment. Are there any declarations or conflicts of interest pertaining to our discussions today? David Spears.
Chair, just before the outset, I thought it might be useful if I just clarify the role I have in Wakaputāhi in respect of decisions around the National Land Transport Plan and National Land Transport Fund. So I have no decision-making role in those processes. So just to be really clear, sitting on this hearing, I don't think creates a conflict with decision-making in that respect.
Thank you for that. That is noted. Moving on, everyone, page 4 of the hard copies that we all have with us, the open minutes of the Regional Land Transport Plan Hearing Subcommittee held on the 13th of April. Would someone move those as a reasonably true and accurate record of that meeting? Deputy Mayor Isles, Councillor Mees. Any matters arising from those minutes? Being none, I'll put them all as in favour. Please say aye. Aye. Against, carried. We now move over, everyone, to page 17 in your agenda. And Rrtp, before we start, there is a typo on the top of page 18 with regard increased weighting for integrated freight resilience. The integrated freight and regional resilience figure should read 15%, not 30. Likewise, better travel options should read 30, not 15. That was actually picked up by members of the public. Now, Rrtp, would you like to set the scene now for the presentation on the Regional Land Transport Regional Programme and prioritised activities?
Tēnā koutou to the panel. We are on page 17 of your agendas, and I have James Llewellyn and Rachel Pinn here, and I probably will just hand straight over to them to take us through.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Morning everyone. My name is James Llewellyn. I'm the Transport and Urban Planning Manager at Bay of Plenty Regional Council, and a colleague on my right, Rachel Pinn, is one of our very valued consultancy staff who has been working through this process probably for longer than you care to remember. And it's our pleasure to present to you this morning on the prioritisation process for the programme of significant activities. And what I want to do in this presentation is essentially summarise the journey that we've been on so far, because I'm mindful there are colleagues who have joined this process relatively recently who may not be fully aware of the history. So it is important we just take a step back and run through that before we then get into the meat of the presentation, which is around how we've actually got to this point and how we move forward towards the finalisation and adoption of the RLTP.
On the side, sorry.
So what I'd like to do is just run through the story so far and then summarise some of the headline concerns that have been raised via the submission process.
So James, just pause one moment. Do you want questions throughout your presentation, or you'd prefer that?
More than happy to have questions at any point, but what I will do is pause after each slide so that people can ask questions. So we'll have a look at the GPS and the prioritisation criteria. And then I anticipate the meat of the discussion will be around a number of different scenarios that we have run in order to test the impact on the prioritised list of significant activities. Then we'll go through some recommendations that staff have come up with, and of course it's for the committee to decide whether those recommendations are ones they want to support or whether they would like to do something different, and then sketch out the next steps for the finalisation of the process. So is that okay? So in terms of the story so far, I want to take you back to the 7th of August at the RTC meeting. And at that point, there was a recommendation that RTC adopts the RLT prioritisation approach that was developed by the local government Transport Special Interest Group, or TSIG. And there has been some confusion, I think, amongst some colleagues about the method that we have actually followed. So there has been some concern expressed that another prioritisation method, which is the Waka Kotahi investment prioritisation method for the National Land Transport Programme, has not been used. But to be very clear with the committee, the TSIG methodology was developed in conjunction and in partnership with Waka Kotahi, and it was developed specifically for the regional land transport plan prioritisation process. So it's just very important to be clear about what document we've used, and I've got a copy here for anyone who would like to have a look at it. So the decision to adopt the TSIG prioritisation approach was approved by RTC, and there were no amendments to that. And at that meeting, it was also confirmed around the direction in relation to some critical elements of the RRTP. So the vision, the objectives, and policies. Fast forward to the 12th of November. So at this point, technical officers from Regional Council and the various territorial land authorities had undertaken their assessments of the scores for the activities that were being proposed for the RLTP. So in essence, scores were allocated and then discussed and moderated at this particular meeting. Again, that's very important to emphasise, because the territorial land authorities and the officers within those organisations have been doing a lot of work to ensure that there is a robust and evidence-based approach to those scores. That then carries forward into the prioritisation process itself. So although we have talked a lot about the weightings of the criteria, we have to remember that's only one part of the story. It's the scores against the four investment priority objectives that are as relevant as the weightings themselves. So at that meeting, that was the first time that a draft prioritised list of activities had been produced, and it was circulated post-meeting. And that was the list that was agreed essentially prior to the next meeting, which is the 3rd of December workshop. So at the bottom of the slide, the main issues at that workshop are summarised. So in advance of that workshop, RTC members had an opportunity to review both the draft document as it was put together and the prioritised list of significant activities which aims to give effect to that draft document. So at that meeting and in the paper that accompanied the report, there was a request for RTC to consider and provide guidance on that draft prioritised list of significant activities. And one of the key points, which is set out in the notes, was a concern around the lack of alignment with a low carbon transport system and people-centred transport system. More could be done given that the previous day, the 2nd of December, the climate emergency had been declared. So in essence, the feedback we received from RTC members was that they looked at the investment narrative in the Rrtp document and were broadly happy that it was consistent with the GPS and consistent with the climate emergency, but they were concerned that the prioritised list of significant activities was less consistent. So in other words, there was a misalignment between the two. And that really is the fundamental issue about how you actually get those two pieces of work aligned. So there's a lot of discussion, but I think it is important to recognise that in the notes of the meeting, there was actually no specific direction received on making changes to the prioritisation methodology and criteria weighting. So although staff believed that there was a need to look at another option, given the flavour of the discussion, there was no direction as to actually what to do. So at that point, I'll take questions.
James, just pause a moment.
Okay, that's me. So sorry.
Bring home milk.
No.
Councillor Lees.
At a workshop, we can't make decisions anyway, but we can provide
Flag direction.
comments and flag direction. And you're saying that no direction was given.
So I'm saying, through the chair, I'm saying that the notes of the meeting do not record any direction that was given. There was certainly a lot of discussion and various points of view, but no specific direction as to what to do.
Any other questions from panel members? Keep going, James.
So moving on, technical officers went away and on the 15th of January had another meeting. So this is where revised priority weightings and a prioritised list were discussed by officers. So in essence, staff went away and revised the criteria weightings to better reflect the discussions that took place on the 3rd of December meetings. And that prioritised list was discussed, and it's important to note that no significant or any concerns were raised by officers in relation to the change of weightings. That isn't to say there wasn't Some concern about the fact that there would be a change to priority order, because understandably, every council wants to see its list to reflect their activities as much as possible. That's understandable. But no one was saying, well, this is a fundamentally wrong way of doing things. So that again is important to recognise. So following the RAG meeting, 4 days later, we went back to the 19th of February RTC workshop, where staff tabled the revised list of significant activities, and those were discussed by members. And concerns were expressed by one member in particular around the change that was made to the criteria weightings. And that isn't to say other members weren't concerned and discussed different scenarios, but there's one member in particular who was very vocal in his disagreement as to what we'd actually done. And that's fair enough, because that's the purpose of these meetings, is to ensure that all views are heard and that we then take appropriate action to address those concerns. So as a result of those concerns, there was a discussion and agreement to look at, and again, a number of different scenarios, which are the ones that we'll discuss a little bit later in this presentation. So at the RTC meeting itself, which was in the afternoon after the workshop, the important decision was that irrespective of concerns expressed in the workshop, we were able to effectively adopt the draft RLTP, the prioritised list of significant activities, and get those approved for public consultation, on the understanding, of course, that once public consultation has occurred, then there's another opportunity to look at things again and to consider submissions raised. And that's essentially the point we've got to now. So any other questions on the story so far?
James, I think it's fair to note that at the 19th of February workshop, that concern was raised by His Worship the Mayor of Western Bay of Plenty, speaking from a position of influence and authority in the Western Bay. So I'm not demeaning anyone else's contribution, but I think it's worthy to note that that was one of our key TLA leaders who was expressing that concern. So.
Yes, Mr. Chair, and I agree. I think that's why I made it specifically clear in that bullet point. There was one member, because, as you rightly say, that is someone who we have to listen to very strongly.
Any other questions to James on this particular slide, or the slide that's just finished?
Sorry, there he goes.
Oh, Commissioner,
Sorry, just to
Commissioner Sell.
the date should be the 19th of February 2021 on that second to last arrow.
Very good. Well spotted.
Well spotted.
Yeah, thank you.
Moving on, James.
So, as we will discuss in the next part of this meeting, we've had a lot of submissions, and we'll go through all of them, or as many as you want in that time. But at this point, I think it is helpful to summarise a few of the headline concerns that were raised through the submission process. So there were four particular points that I wanted to bring to your attention. So the first of those expresses concern that weightings for the prioritisation criteria were changed between the meeting on the 3rd of December 2020 and the 19th of November 2021, when the RLTP was adopted. So it should be January. I'm having not much luck with dates here, am I? So yeah, 19th of January. So, again, that reflected the contribution of one of our RTC senior members. So that was expressed as a formal submission.
James, I can say that as chair, that's Western Bay of Plenty.
Yeah. So, yeah. And as the next one, the request was then that the activities that were prioritised using weightings tabled at what should be the 3rd of December 2020 meeting. So in essence, the submission was saying, please can you change the weightings back to what they were before you went out to public consultation. A couple of other points which are relevant, and actually I do want to discuss, as well as the prioritisation weightings, because I think these are just as important. So the first of those actually requested a better description of the prioritisation process, which, to be fair, in the draft document could have been more detailed and more informative, and understand the alignment with the TSIG methodology. So I think we fully recognise that we could have done a better job of actually saying how we got to that point of the process. So the last one I think is also an interesting one, because it speaks to an issue that I'll deal with in the next slide around the GPS. So there's been a concern from one TLA in particular that the prioritisation don't explicitly recognise the importance of transport investment to support planned growth. So before I move on, has anyone got any comments on those points?
Commissioner Selwood.
Through you, just to note that that submitter 3513 is on the City Council.
Thank you, Commissioner. Councillor Nees.
Just in the context of that submission, there are many different sorts of transport investment. So there's investment in planning and business cases, there's investment in public transport, there's investment in state highway infrastructure and local roads. So in the context of those different activities, was that comment made in the round, looking at all of those different activities, or just one specific type of activity? Because I believe we have got a lot of business cases and a lot of planning support roles in the plan.
Yeah, through the chair, we can actually deal with that point on the next slide, but I would say I think it is a general point about the 4 investment criteria which reflect the GPS as opposed to anything specific.
So,
Councillor Nees.
sorry, the issue is we are trying to give effect to the 4 investment criteria in the GPS which don't mention growth. And so
That's right.
Yes, okay.
In fact, here they are. So this is actually the next slide, which shows the 4 GPS criteria. So safety, which is about developing a transport system where no one is killed or seriously injured. Better travel options, which is the providing with people with better transport options to access social and economic opportunities. Then we have the low carbon transport system supporting emissions reductions while improving safety and inclusive access. And then improving freight connections for economic development. So the response I would make to that last point, which I think is a good one, is that for me, growth is happening and will happen. It's a given. It is something that we're not saying is not part of our future investment. And on that basis, my advice would be growth is actually implicit in many of those criteria. So to take, for example, the better travel options criteria, that would apply to new developments or intensification of existing developments. So we would look at those developments through that lens. We wouldn't say, well, just because it's a new development and there's no explicit growth criteria, therefore we would mark that particular activity down. And I think similarly with safety and certainly with improving freight connections and climate change, all of those have a growth aspect associated with them. And quite frankly, a lot of the activities that we are putting forward, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't be doing in the same way in the Western Bay if growth wasn't happening to the extent that it is. So that's my view, but I'm happy to be challenged and for further discussion.
Commissioner Selwood.
If I may, I mean, I think that the broad observation that has been made by the council here is the criticality of integrating housing growth and transport connectivity, which, when you read the GPS, is not explicit. It's inferred, or it's implied, and one can infer it, and I think the advice that has been given reflects that. And in fact, indeed, you can infer it from all of the four criteria, but we do have a difficulty in Tauranga that our ability to accelerate the provision of housing, particularly at an affordable price, is dependent on transport and vice versa. And so therefore, in consideration of how projects contribute to that need, is a very important weighting, or should be a very important weighting in our consideration. And so the purpose of our statement was to elevate that in the minds of panel members. Because there is a danger that if you don't keep focused on that challenge, we'll end up compromising the outcomes for the city and therefore missing an opportunity. So that is the purpose of that statement.
Keep going, James.
Okay, so I mentioned that following the discussions that we had on the 19th of February workshop, there was an agreement to look at a number of different scenarios which would essentially reflect different weightings for the four investment criteria. And so this table essentially summarises the work that Rachel has undertaken to consider those different scenarios. So scenario one is the prioritised list of significant activities as it was consulted upon in the draft Rrtp. So that was approved at the 19th of February RTC meeting. And so you'll see that climate change has 25%, safety 30%, integrated freight and region resilience 10%, and better travel options 35%. Scenario two is the prioritised list of significant activities that was presented to the 3rd of December 2020 RTC meeting. So that was the prioritised list that did raise concerns from some members of the committee about the alignment between the investment narrative and the actual list of activities. So as you can see, the actual major difference is between the criteria of better travel options and integrated freight and regional resilience. So integrated freight and regional resilience had 35% under that scenario, better travel options only 15%. Climate change was slightly lower at 20% and safety stayed the same. Scenarios 3 and 4 are the two new variants that Rachel has tested on our behalf. So scenario 3 just simply says, let's weight all four priorities equally. Quite simple. And scenario 4 is an additional sensitivity test that was requested by the Deliberations Subcommittee. And so that one had climate change the same at 25%, safety 30%, and a slight increase for integrated freight and regional resilience from 10% under scenario 1 to 15% under scenario 2. and a consequent reduction in the better travel options from 35% to 30%. So what you can see really from that table is the major changes in the criteria under all those four scenarios are between the two on the right-hand side. So safety and climate change only vary by a maximum of 5% under any scenario. It's the other two that make the change. So before I carry on, has anyone got any questions?
Right, I can imagine we've hit ground zero. Commissioner Selwood, then Councillor Nees.
Thank you, Chair. And if I may, just before we have that discussion, can I refer you back to the previous slide because, no, the one before, sorry. The one that had the issues that were raised by submitters.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Because, yes, I'm just checking because one of the key concerns that was raised by the Tauranga City Council submission was on 286 of our papers, 3512. And this is relevant because it also relates to the concern that's been raised by Western Bay Plenty District Council. And that was a concern that the weighting given to freight and resilience, which is the primary category where the needs of business and commercial traffic in the city can be considered in detail, although one could argue it is also under better transport options. Given the nature of the small business and the significance of small business in this city, Tauranga City Council was concerned that that had not been given sufficient weighting, and that matter hasn't been expressed up there, and it was one of the key concerns raised by the city. So I just wanted to register that because it's very consistent with Western Bay's concerns.
Councillor Nees.
So just to be clear, the different weightings we apply make a difference to the positions that the different projects occupy on the list. And the projects that tend to float to the top when freight is weighted higher tend to be the roading type, state highway type projects. Is that clear to say?
Through the chair, we've actually got 4 slides showing the top 10 list of each of the projects. So we can answer that question as we go through if you like.
Okay, and better travel option picks up the alternative modes, the public transport, the low carbon modes of transport, walking, cycling, etc. So you will address the issue that when you get to the prioritised list, but there's a comment in your report that it says, talking about scenario 2, and you say this scenario sees some state highway improvement activities score more highly, whereas scenario 3 is very similar to the prioritised list consulted upon in the draft Rrtp, which is scenario 1. Now, I have a look at those 2 scenarios, scenario 3 and scenario 1, and they're not the same. The lists are different. So I just wonder, what was your justification for those comments on page 28? And if we, as you go through the next slides, if you could explain why you say that.
Yeah, but I think if we go through the top 10 of the 4 scenarios, hopefully we can try and explore that in more detail.
So, Commissioner Selwood, when we composed or constituted this committee, Western Bay made it very clear on the day that they were happy for you to represent their views. I know you can't speak for them, but are you sort of saying that you are steering towards scenario 4, you and Western Bay, TCC and Western Bay? Because I'm mindful in the list of work programs that we're going to put up, I think it's Turret Road, and speaking not as a local here, Turret Road and 15th Avenue dropped down a number of degrees. Other than that, there's very few changes. So can you just clarify whether what extent you're speaking on behalf of Mayor Webber and Western Bay, because that does bring a lot of clout to our discussions.
Yeah, I can clarify that, and I had a discussion with Mayor Webber prior to the meeting. His position is still serious concern of the weighting, or the inadequacy in his view of the weighting to freight and resilience, and he stands by his very previous position, and so does the council, that the weighting should be 35, as in scenario 2. Taurang's position is different to that, but we do want to see an increased weighting for freight and resilience, which I'll speak to later. But I did have a query, Chair, if I may, because I'm wanting to get an understanding of how the officers saw, or how they defined better, as in better travel options. What is better?
James.
Better from the perspective of a user is having options available that are more convenient, or perhaps they don't even exist at all at the moment, and the particular activity gives them another choice. So to take an example, better travel options would be where activities either provide new or improved bus services, so people have an option to use a service that previously wasn't there or only ran very infrequently. Or it could also talk to the performance of existing services in terms of things like reliability, so you have a better travel option when it turns up every day and isn't late. Or you'd have a better travel option if your journey was actually faster and you didn't get stuck in traffic all the way down Cameron Road, for example. So it's very much about looking at the user perspective and saying, well, what better levels of service can we give to people who would like to not use a single occupancy private car, or perhaps don't have the choice to use a single occupancy private car. So that's very much at the front of our minds when we're talking about what better actually means.
Namuta.
Through the chair, just perhaps to add to James's point, it also does mean that if people are choosing other options and opportunities through the better travel options, then you may anticipate that motive. People will be on public transport. It will free up the roads so that people that need to use the roads can use the roads. So that's the other side to it.
That's in a perfect world.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, because I think it's important to understand is that effectively I infer from that better travel options are alternatives to the private motor car or to the private vehicle, I should say, right?
That's right.
So I think we should clearly understand that. So that's public transport, walking and cycling is effectively what we're saying, and doesn't include new routes that might give motor cars a better travel option, for example.
No, I don't think it would support new routes, but what it would do, and I think this is a very important point, is enable the existing routes, which we will rely on, to be better used and prioritised for the journeys that absolutely have to use them. Now that includes freight, and it includes tradies and people who we know do not have a choice but to use their motor vehicle. So what we're trying to do here is recognise we have finite space, we have finite levels of investment. We can't build our way out of the problem. So better travel options for me is as much about supporting the people who do need to use their motor vehicles as it is about providing alternatives for others. So the aim, in a perfect world, of course, is that we have a win-win.
And of course, it would also, through you, Chair, if it would also contribute to climate change reduction for alternative modes as well.
Thank you, Mayor Donaldson.
a slight, I guess, alternative view on the commentary regarding better travel options, excluding the private motor vehicle. I'm mindful of the Wednesday initiative, and so more efficient use by the way of, for example, carpooling of the private motor vehicle is also one of the better travel options that was thrown up.
Yeah, through the chair, I'd absolutely agree with that. I think we've got to be very clear that our biggest enemy is the single occupancy private car, and actually we can make better use of the cars that are out there on the road if people do share their travel. So I'd absolutely agree with that. And I would also make the point that fundamentally congestion on our network is a reflection of that very high level of single occupancy travel demand, and a reflection of, over many years, the success that the private car has had in providing the most convenient choice for the majority of people. But actually, better travel options is about making conditions better for those people who have to use the vehicles on the existing network.
Commissioner Selwood.
Don't disagree insofar as that is possible, because the reality is their traffic volumes will continue to increase. And, you know, that is the reality of growth. The other point that we have missed from the discussion too, which I think is important to be recognised, is the significance of the trip that doesn't happen. The work from home is a travel option, and arguably a better travel option. So it's important to keep that in mind for balance. Thank you.
So are we steering around to a point where we're about to select a scenario? So, Councillor Nees.
No, I'd like to actually see the impact of any changes to the weighting that we make, and I think you're going to go on to that. But the other point I wanted to raise is the priority in different projects take on the big long list is less relevant to where it sits on the list within their activity class. Isn't that right? Because the central government, when our regional transport plan goes up to them, they don't look at a project and say that's number 53 on the regional transport plan list. They say, oh, it's number 1 on the state highway program list for the Bay of Plenty. Or, David, does it say nationally, when they're all put together, it's number 217 of the national list? Isn't that the way it works? Our full list is less relevant. The weightings and where they sit on the full list is less relevant than where they sit on our activity list, the same activities.
David.
I think you got to be clear that your full list serves 2 purposes. So one of those is National Land Transport Fund allocation, which, as you described, is going to be based on activity classes, 10 activity classes. They've got a level of minimum funding and then a variable level of funding depending on government's decisions around prioritisation. We look at those in terms of activity class. So you're right, if your first priority in public transport investment is number 12 on your list, well, that's still your first priority. But that is still nuanced by how important that is to this region versus, another region where it might be, their first priority public transport might be number 40 on their list. That nuance will still be important.
Yeah.
So you still want to reflect that in the list, and I think that's really, really critical. And the other purpose it serves, of course, is the investment that you collectively make, irrespective of central government funding. And there's a bunch of interventions that are just as important that can be undertaken. And so I think you need to bear that in mind as well. Yeah, so there's a duality of purpose here, which I think is quite important, and that's why that nuance is taken into account in the.
Yeah, so it's quite important we understand the implications of our decisions on the weightings to the list, both the activity lists and the the call list. So from what I'm seeing, they're not moving hugely, like that when you have a look at them, the weightings might move things up and down 4 or 5 places, but not radically. Would you agree with that?
Rachel?
Thank you. Sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat, which is why I'm making James do all the hard work. Yeah, and sometimes you just see them sort of almost platoon together. So, you know, your road to zero ones move up and down, but they all stay relative to each other as you adjust things. I think one of the things that is hard to articulate, and there's been considerable focus on the percentages, but actually there's a lot of discussion that goes on at that technical level with the staff across the different organisations to make sure that there's actually some logic in what comes out. And one of the risks with changing the weightings, even with that slight changes, sometimes projects that are actually quite important for a location and interrelated with other projects can shift down even 1 or 2, and then they're, you know, further away from each other. And what I've seen with some of these is that changing that percentage to, for example, to scenario 4, put some projects up on the list above projects that were, so I'll give you an example. So Turret Road moves out of the top 10. It's quite a high priority for Tauranga City, and one of the state highway projects moves into that list. But that project, as a business case planning optimisation process, it's scheduled for the 7 to 10 year time frame. So you kind of have these unintended consequences. It's quite hard to articulate. I take your point around the trying to explain how much of a difference there is between the different scenarios. It's actually quite hard to do that little summary. So when you're saying about what's the difference between, you're saying they're quite similar. My paper says it's quite similar for scenario 3. I was trying to summarise the overall list and how similar it is, which is kind of tricky to get your head around. So I apologise if it's not, you know, you look at that and think it doesn't quite add up. Does that help? Yeah.
Rachel, just pause and rest your voice for a moment. David?
So I was going to ask Rachel to speak again.
I could try on her behalf if you want.
Yeah. So I've noted down here that the shifts that occur, and as you say, Turret Road, Rrtp area, public transport facility, and Tauranga Hospital all move out of the top 10 between scenario 1 and scenario 4. Can we take from what you said simplistically, because I'm simple, that by doing that and promoting, for example, the State Highway project, which is, as you say, a business case, it's not going to be till year 7 or 9, that in the 3-year window, what effectively the impact of this is that in that 3-year window we're signalling, actually we're not too worried about these other projects and we potentially miss the opportunity of having those brought forward into funding. Yeah, enough said. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I just agree with that. I do also think that, yes, we focus on those percentages and definitely managing freight and regional resilience is important. But there's also not a significant amount of projects that are freight-specific projects within that list. So I just want to make you aware of that. There's considerable focus, particularly through the TSP, around multimodal. And if you look down that list and you just do a quick scan, you'll see that that's a huge focus. And as James has said, perhaps we're optimists as transport planners, but we hope to see, by giving people better transport options, that we'll see a shift where people can and where it makes sense, that people will walk and cycle or they'll take public transport, and that will enable our economy to move more efficiently. So although they are different things, hopefully they achieve those outcomes as well. I may be over optimistic. I think your comments, Stephen, were quite realistic about the impacts of growth, but we do hope to see a better balance. We clearly are quite out of balance in terms of car use here in Tauranga particularly.
David?
Just while you're talking about that role of good transport planning, because I've been getting a beginner's class in transport planning from the transport planners at Rrtp. I just want to come back to Commissioner Selwood's point about Stephen is fine. To Stephen's point about growth and planning for growth and the extent to which this investment, let's say scenario 1 and scenario 4, is proactive in driving that growth, because I think that's also the thing we have to be cognizant of, is that the role of good transport planning and good transport investment is also to drive growth into appropriate places as opposed to an. So I sort of said that as a statement rather than a question, but I'm actually asking for your commentary about how much this gives effect to that philosophy. Scenario 1 versus scenario 4 versus scenario whatever.
Yeah, through the chair, I think, to be honest, whatever scenario that you pick, the projects and the activities that we put forward, particularly those that are aimed at the better travel options, have within them a mandate to actually understand that we need to deal with the growth that is being promoted through the spatial planning, smart growth, all of the MHUD activities around priority development areas. So from a public transport perspective, what that means is that rather than our future business case looking at providing more services and frequency between areas that already actually got quite good frequency, we need to be looking at areas that are not well served, or the greenfield sites that at the moment are absent in any development, and work out how we are going to serve those and promote the dense urban form that we actually want and need in those locations. So if we get funding for that services and infrastructure business case, it will be heavily influenced by where growth is going to go and how we're going to get a really good mode split for trips from and to that development from day one.
We have to take a break if everyone's agreeable. So for panel members, it's downstairs. For the staff, and you, Glenn, you're representing the whole Bay of Plenty public here today. So,
and the media now.
And the media too, yes. We smoked them out after 5 minutes. They can stay.
Stay there like, oh.
Okay, so we'll take a 15-minute adjournment, everybody. So,
percentage if it's got a high weighting for freight. It's just that subtlety. But like you say, it is. It's interesting how it's played out, because I would have thought it wouldn't have made a considerable amount of difference. I would also note that with Hewlett's Road, it scores lower, but it's been brought up to be with Tokra Street. So that was in a previous. I think it was in one of the papers that we went to. The RTC meeting in February, I think. So that's just because they kind of appear. And when I was talking to Cole about the implications of Turret Road dropping down, he said, where's his mouth, sorry, but he kind of said, well, Hewlett's Road and Turret, they want to kind of plan at the same time, because when you think about the state highway network, they appear as well. So there's some things in there that are probably not easy to articulate than just a simple list, but there's a lot of discussion and planning that's gone on between us to kind of balance those issues off and make sure it makes sense.
David?
Yeah, probably that's actually moved on from my comment. I did wonder if it would be worth just, notwithstanding that the details of these are in the Rrtp anyway, a quick, this is,
I move to point of clarification. Okay,
So through the chair, as David's mentioned, the request was to see the list by activity class. And so in the regional land transport plan that we consulted on, which is your scenario 1, we did break it down by activity class. So certainly I can write it up on the whiteboard, but for example, your road to zeros, you've got Thornton Road, you've got State Highway 30, State Highway 35, another State Highway 30, State Highway 36, State Highway 2, quite a few on State Highway 2, State Highway 5, Tauranga Urban Package, West Rotorua Urban and Taupo Napier. Under public transport service improvements, you've got, this is for scenario 1 still, Tauranga Public Transport Key Journeys business case, Tauranga Western Bay service, Western Bay of Plenty business service enhancements, Rotorua bus service enhancements, and then under public transport infrastructure, you've got Tauranga combined bus services and supporting infrastructure, Tauranga CBD, Turret and 15th Ave, Welcome Bay multimodal improvements, Arataki, Tauranga Hospital, PT facility, State Highway 29, Rrtp, Park and Ride, Papamoa, and it goes on in terms of, I can provide the page numbers if that's useful, or I can mark up something on a whiteboard if that's useful. In terms, that was public transport infrastructure. We've also got under walking and cycling improvements, Totara Street multimodal, the primary cycle route area A, Mount Papamoa CBD, primary cycle route B, Utamoto Field, Te Papa East, West active modes, Te Papa North, 2 Te Papa Norths, Western Bay walking, cycling implementation, Pakatani cycle trails, Rotorua Te Puki, and then it goes on to local road improvements, Tauriko West Enabling Works Package, Totara Street multimodal, coastlands integrated growth and resilience improvements, Papamoa East Interchange, Mount Spatial Plan, Utamoto Spatial Plan, Taki accessibility and placemaking, etc., etc. So that's within your regional land transport plan, starting on page 87. That's for scenario 1. You can see the activity classes, so you could, based on scenario 1 and where those are in the activity classes, you can look at a specific project and see what class it might be in for each of them.
Deputy Mayor Donaldson.
I think that just about answers my question, but the 4 slides on the top 10 is very much a Western Bay Tauranga conversation, but we're all here for the good of the Bay of Plenty. When I look at the one that's key for Rotorua, and that's public transport enhancements, it hovers in between 24 in scenario 1 to 32 in scenario 4, and then the other 2 options, it drops way down, and that's a critical one for Rotorua. So I know that's been something that our officers have fed back to me, that they're very happy with how it sits in scenario 1. So I'm very interested to hear the conversation about the top 10 as it affects Western Bay Tauranga, but that's a key concern from Rotorua's perspective as to where that project sits.
Councillor, stay at the table. I'm pretty sure you're going to be called on again as we go through these Tauranga lists. Councillor,
Just a clarification, on the Rrtp it's at 47 and scenario 4 it's at 32. Is that right?
Just looking at the raw lists of 1 to 64 that we've got.
Yeah.
And so scenario 4, it sits at number 32, if I'm right. Yep. It was at 47,
yeah,
and it's moved to 32.
So which scenario do you do?
Scenario 1. It's at number 24 in scenario 1.
Deputy Mayor Isles.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I reiterate or certainly support Deputy Mayor Donaldson's comments with regards to Eastern Bay of Plenty. Scenario 1 would see our highest ranking would be the Whakatane cycle trails, number 40. The rest of it, yeah, late 40s. Again, heavily supporting the Western Bay, but again, as has already been said, we're here representing the whole of the Bay community. Scenario 1.
Are we getting to the pointy edge? Commissioner Selwood, lead off.
Thank you. Just before I do lead off on the ranking, I do see point of clarification, particularly on Hewlett's Road sub-area. I'm struggling to understand why I would perceive to be a freight-oriented project, or quite a significant freight component anyway, has gone down in those scenarios where the integrated freight and regional resilience weighting has been increased.
So in scenario one, it sits at number 10.
Yes, but in scenario 3, it has gone to 16, and in scenario 4, just lost it for a second, it's gone down further, I think. No, sorry, it's gone up to 5. So if it goes up when the rating's been increased by 5%, but then goes down when it's been increased by 10 or 15%, I'm really struggling to understand what's going on here.
Through you, Mr. Chair, as I said before, what I've done is link. So Hewlett's Road sub-area accessibility improvements itself doesn't score as highly as where it sits on the list. At the previous RTC meeting, one of the notes was to link Tokra Street multimodal and Hewlett's Road together. So it may be that scenario 3.
It doesn't seem to have happened.
Yeah, and that just maybe, and then that was a one-off. There's not any other ones that are like that follow each other.
Councillor Needs.
So can I just finish on that point, because, so does that mean that under scenario 3, Hewlett's Road would be linked to Tokara as it has been with the other scenarios?
For you, Mr. Chair, I'd recommend that if the Deliberations Committee choose to use scenario 3, that we continue that linkage.
Councillor Needs.
Sorry, I'm feeling very sick. On page 72, we have scenario 1. And for the first page of that, the numbers are the same for the draft Rrtp in scenario 1, which is what we expect, because that's what we read out with the draft Rrtp. You look at page 2 and the numbers start changing. So that's the point that Mayor Donaldson brought up, that I would have thought the Rotorua bus service enhancements would be the same in column 1 and column 2.
Through you, Mr. Chair, as a result of the submissions process, we went back to the RAG and rescored Rotorua and had a discussion with the RAG group about where that's sat, because obviously that had come through pretty strongly at the workshops on the when we were talking about significant activities earlier, that it seemed a bit peculiar that it was so far down the list. So we've rescored that. You'll also see that Rrtp Business Park is also scored now, and that will have pushed the projects that are from 30 onwards down slightly. So there has been some amendments made as a result also of the consultation process and feedback to date.
So that re-weighting has been reflected in all of the different scenarios as well.
Chair, yes, that's correct.
I just concur with Deputy Mayor Donaldson's comments. You know, whilst some of us sit here bringing a Bay of Plenty wide perspective, I, not only as chairperson but as a member of this committee, I'm guided very much by Western Bay and TCC colleagues as to where they want us to land. So, with my support, whatever way you want to go. Okay, I'll leave up.
Thank you, Chair. So Tauranga City Council would like to see option 3, or scenario 3, as the preferred option. Our rationale for that is the need to take a balanced approach in the prioritisation of projects. The GPS, which we are required by law to be consistent with, is very clear in setting out the 4 criteria. It doesn't signal any particular weighting to any particular one of those 4 criteria. Indeed, I think its very ethos is about trying to achieve a balanced approach. And in terms of the desire, and I certainly acknowledge and agree with the need to move on climate change, By the time you take into consideration the weighting given to climate change at 25% under scenario 3, and the weighting given to, I'm going to describe it as alternative transport modes rather than better transport, to be clear about actually what that scenario describes. But even accepting the words better transport options, there's a very heavy climate change flavour in that scenario as well, or that weighting. So in effect, both initiatives make a significant step towards climate change, and I think we satisfy our legal responsibilities in that regard. The other issue that is of significance to Tauranga City is the one that was raised before, of the importance of transport connectivity to housing, economic development and the port. And the citizens of Tauranga, and indeed this is true of the Western Bay, and I know I speak in this regard on their behalf because their preference was to go for a higher weighting. So I think everything I say contributes towards their position. The significance of small business, connectivity to the port, the economy on which the livelihoods of all our citizens depend, and also the significance of the concerns raised in our community about congestion and the impact that is having on desirability and quality of life are all uppermost in our minds. So to achieve a balanced kind of scenario is what we think is the right imperative here, because we have to balance the need to address climate change, a shift to alternative modes, with our need to also address safety and freight and regional resilience. And they are all imperatives of which, in our view, are equally critical. So that's the basis of our recommendation, and I would prefer to see the recommendation changed to support scenario 3.
I'll take it that you've given notice of a motion coming up. I'll just park that to one side if you're happy with that. Councillor Neves.
Fortunately, I've got a counter view. I acknowledge that we've had submissions to increase the freight weighting. And I'm also cognizant of the fact that we do not want, we've got to look at natural justice. We went out with a plan where we signalled some weightings and we got a large amount of support for the plan. But we did get some submissions about increasing freight weightings. But I don't believe that natural justice will be served if we make a major shift in the weightings and a major shift in priorities at this point. It is possible, there's a risk of judicial review if we make too major change at this point. So my preference is scenario 4 and my fallback position is scenario 1, Mr. Chair.
This is going to be interesting. Deputy Mayor Donalds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Another horse, Deputy Mayor.
If I can talk to the 4 scenarios. So for me, scenario 2 is too much of a departure from the draft that was submitted on to be even enter into consideration. Scenario 3 lacks finesse. I think it was just an arbitrary 25% across the board, and I think dropping safety down is a risk. I don't see as that is the way the plan should go. And it drops Rrtp bus down to number 40 on the list from 24 or 32. So Rrtp public transport enhancements. My much preferred option is the one that was that went out for consultation, scenario 1, and I have faith in the officers who workshop this and put the draft plan together or the priority list together. My second fallback option would be scenario 4, but I take note of the point. I didn't see great call for an increase in freight and resilience coming through in the submissions. So I would be supporting scenario 1.
David.
Mr. Chair, can I suggest that having heard all of that, it would be really nice.
Do you want to wait and hear from Deputy Mayor Isles?
Yeah, when that's done, I just sort of think we should let the staff walk us through their recommendation, having heard all of that, and maybe pick up on one of the things I'm conscious of is how many connections there are between these projects. So, but I'm holding off on.
Deputy Mayor Isles?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I've already indicated I would support scenario 1. Again, like Councillor Nees, I'm just a little bit aware of the judicial review that we may be subjected to if we move too far in our waiting. So I support 1.
Back to you, David.
I can see what
James?
Right, here we go. So this is the officer recommendation, and that is to retain the prioritisation weightings as per the Rrtp public consultation draft, which means scenario 1. And we've set out a number of reasons why we think this is the best approach. So the first of those is that through the submissions process, we believe there was evidence of broad support for the Rrtp investment strategy, which it should be noted it's very different from previous strategies, which were a lot more focused on investment in state highway improvements in particular. We also saw evidence of support for mode shift, which is something that Waka Kotahi are now very strong on. And we certainly didn't detect any massive resistance to the prioritised programme as it was set out. That isn't to say that everyone would agree with every ranking, but we didn't get the sense that there was a groundswell of opinion that said you've got this completely wrong and there are lots of other activities that should be much higher. The second reason is that we do believe there is strong consistency with GPS and climate emergency. And I think that point is particularly important because as a transport planner who is trying to understand how we tackle greenhouse gas emissions, quite frankly, the climate emergency tells us if we don't take action now and prioritise the climate, we don't have another one, and it will be too late for the generations that follow us. And so front and centre of our advice is that with the best will in the world, climate is something that has to be the lens across everything that we do. And so that's why we feel that, yes, it is important to have balanced activities. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But we don't see in the work that we've done and in the programme we've put together evidence that we are failing in our duties to look at climate as being the preeminent challenge we face as humankind. Now, getting back to more grounded issues, we also feel that the prioritised list and the Rrtp as a whole does reflect the key initiatives such as Rrtp and TSP, which are strongly supportive of the multimodal approach and of promoting better travel options. RAG officers from across the region have genuinely been supportive of the approach. We've had really good levels of engagement with RAG officers, and if they told us collectively or individually that they had serious issues with the prioritised list, then we would have clearly had to have thought again. Perhaps most importantly, from an investment prioritisation funding perspective, we haven't had any significant pushback from Waka Kotahi telling us that we've got it wrong. And in fact, on the contrary, we've had a very supportive letter from the Director of Regional Relationships, effectively complimenting us on on our approach and recognising that we do deliver against the GPS. There's a couple of other practical issues which I'm not saying that they are things that are showstoppers, but do need to be borne in mind when we're making a decision. The first of those is if we do change the prioritised weightings and the prioritised list, we may need to review the Rrtp document and make changes to investment narrative so that there is a consistency and alignment. And we don't have very much time to do that before we need to go to the RTC. So I'm not saying that's a reason we shouldn't do anything, but it's just something to bear in mind. And a point that was made very correctly by several speakers is that, if we change the order of activities, that could have implications for programming and interdependencies. So under scenario one, as far as possible, we were looking across the programme and working out the interdependencies, and the Totra Street, Hewlett Road example has given us a specific link. If we change the activities, then those interdependencies again would need to be reviewed, and we don't have very much time to do that. So those are the reasons for the recommendations, but I'm very mindful there's a variety of views around the table, and I'm very grateful for the candid nature of the discussion. It certainly helps us as officers understand lessons that we can learn for the future about how we undertake this process.
So just to muddy the waters even further, my preference is 4, but I would default to 1 on the basis that I can get further assurance that better travel options will flow on to freeing up freight and greater regional resilience. Can you just comment on that again?
Yes, I certainly can. So, yeah, we see the primary purpose of better travel options from a network management perspective about working out how we tackle the problem of single occupancy private car travel and the impact that has on the capacity available as we currently have it in Tauranga. So in terms of any business case work that we undertake, one of the key considerations within those business cases is a network hierarchy, and the TSP actually sets out a very good network hierarchy which says which are the routes that need to be prioritised for different modes, and freight is explicitly recognised as one of those modes. So the TSP provides us in Tauranga and the Western Bay with very clear guidance, and therefore business cases that are put together have to reflect that strategic guidance and work out how we use alternative modes to free up that highway space for the priority freight modes across the region. So it will be absolutely key consideration in any business case work we do, because the TSP is very clear on that.
Any further speakers? Councillor Nees.
Just one.
The wisdom of Solomon.
I had not got wisdom of Solomon, but the points that you just made around making changes at this time and the impacts, potential impacts on interdependencies. I need to understand the implications of that with respect to scenario 4. Because there's just, to me, there's a minor tweak in weightings, but a major change in project, moving up and down the front part of the list. So should we go with scenario 4, what does that do to the interdependencies? Does it give you a terrible headache and the things get terribly out of sequence?
Through the chair, the honest answer is we don't know. I mean, that's the work we'd have to go away and do. All I'm highlighting is the risk that if that is the case, then we don't have very much time or leeway to get that done. It might be that there's actually very little risk and that it doesn't really make much difference. But at this stage, the honest answer is we don't know, and that's the bit of work we would have to do.
Chair, we've got a problem.
Well, and I was just going to help you out there, Solomon. In terms of meeting procedure, I've sought the guidance of our committee clerk here, and whatever scenario we put up, we only get four of us to support it to get it across the line. So I'm guided by you all. Do you want to put your motion up first? Which is scenario 3.
Chair, I've been listening to the discussion around the table, and it's clear that scenario 3 will not get support. However, it also seems clear that there seems to be a weighted support towards option 4. So on that basis, I would move the recommendations as they stand, except for item 2, approve scenario 4.
Is there a seconder for that motion? Councillor Nees. It's open for discussion.
That is subject to getting a level of comfort, Mr. Chair, that it's achievable to make those changes and that we're not causing ourselves a huge problem. So how soon can staff give us some comfort about that? Can they give us some comfort during the day?
I'm happy to take an adjournment for 5 minutes if you'd like to put your heads together collectively and come back to us. Okay, I'll move an adjournment for 5 minutes. And
Can I just ask a question before you move the adjournment of staff? So one key difference I see, through you, Mr. Chair, the staff comment was projects, the full prioritised list is 1 to 64. But I see some of the numbers go below that. So the difference being, with my Rotorua hat on, that in scenario 1, the 3 projects related to Rotorua in this prioritised list sneak into that 64, the lowest being number 63, the bus service. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong list. No, they don't. Actually, they're in 65. And so if they score at 65 in the priorities list, they're out of contention altogether. Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily, no, because ultimately Waka Kotahi make decisions through activity classes, not the overall list. That's right.
okay, look, I'll move the adjournment, seconded Councillor Nees, and we'll reconvene at 20 to 12. Okay, I'll reconvene the meeting. There is a motion on the table, moved by Commissioner Selwood, seconded Councillor Nees, that we support scenario 4. But whilst that's on the table, members have sought further clarification, which James, I'll ask you to lead off on, and I know David Spears has a couple of queries he'd like you to address too as part of your presentation. Over to you, James.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we as staff have just had a very quick look at scenario 4 to just try and understand what would happen if that was adopted rather than scenario 1 in terms of the interdependencies between the various projects. So whilst we haven't done any more than a very, very cursory assessment, our view is that scenario 4 appears to promote some activities that in reality are going to be longer term at the expense of other activities that are actually ready to go, at least in terms of getting the business case work started. It also raises an issue about interdependency, for example, between 2 activities that are both focused on different strategic routes across the harbour. So you have the Helix Road sub area, and you have the Turret Road 15th Avenue. Those two, in our view, should be closely aligned and independent. And there is a danger that scenario 4 makes that less likely. So that's in the time we've had available, what we've been able to do. But what it does show is that we would need to spend some time, particularly working with colleagues at the City Council, because a lot of this stuff has come through the Transport System Plan. They've done work to understand the interdependencies. They're very clear in their own minds about what needs to happen when. And certainly I think they might be concerned if Turret Road, as an example, drops down the list because of its criticality to so much else that's going on, not only across that strategic route, State Highway 29, but also the Take-Up Peninsula and all the work that's going on Cameron Road.
David, you wanted to have some concerns?
I think, funnily enough, that's actually answered my question, which was really about that interdependency and the impacts of, as James has expressed, bringing projects forward that have got a longer time horizon at the expense of projects that are closer. I do, that's picked up on that issue.
Commissioner Selwood, you've got a motion on the floor. I'll give notice if it fails. I'll put up scenario 1. So I'm guided by you, Commissioner.
Thank you. If I could just make some comments.
You're entitled to that, go for it.
To me, the issue of whether or not this requires rework should not be driving our consideration of the issue. I'm sure that work can be done. And I'm getting confirmation from my staff at the back of the room. And I do recognise the significance and importance of Turret Road and the interdependency of that project, and would ask that when that work was done, that those interdependencies are considered, just as already Hewlett's Road has been linked to Pototo Street. The question of whether or not we should be prioritising business cases as opposed to actual projects, I think is one that needs people to consider, because if we don't do the business cases, we don't get the projects even in the long term. And State Highway 29 is one of the most significant problem areas we have in Tauranga City. It is a strategic link between Waikato and the port. It is a serious safety challenge. It is heavily congested, and it is material to us enabling housing development in Tauranga West, among a whole lot of other features, which is why I'm actually quite happy that State Highway 29 business case has gone up in the ranking, because frankly, unless we progress that major project along with the others, we will not address some of the significant challenges the city faces. The other important consideration is the concern about the ranking of business cases on the basis that the project won't proceed for 10 years may not be valid. If we were to find alternative funding through private financing as one potential avenue that the Commission in Tauranga is actively pursuing, then the opportunity to advance that project is definitely on the table. So I don't think we should let funding drive the decisions that we need to take. We need to make the right decisions for our region and for our city, and then we should find out how we fund it. And there are options that aren't on the table at the moment that could be pursued. So that's what justifies my preference for option 4, and I still leave the motion for consideration.
Councillor Lees.
Mr. Chair, there's a difference between prioritisation and programming.
I don't think you want.
There's a difference between prioritisation and programming. And as I understand it, the programming for that business case for State Highway 29 is not programmed until when?
Rrtp 7 and 8.
7 and 8. Would external funding bring that forward, or would it be dependent on Waka Kotahi's prioritisation process and resource allocation?
I don't think that's a question I can answer. Sorry.
So it's a maybe. I'm finding this quite a challenge. I'm listening to the staff, and I've got to say I've got nothing but an open mind, and I'm considering withdrawing my seconding of the motion, Mr. Chair, because I'm concerned about some of the implications that the staff have raised.
Okay, you're withdrawing your seconding, or do you want an answer from the staff first to help you make your decision?
Well, I'm getting very strong direction from the staff that a change is going to cause problems in, one, getting some key projects over the line, and two, in keeping interrelated projects together. So if that is the case, I did not understand that fully when I seconded the resolution. If staff confirm that that is the case, then I will withdraw my second motion.
Rachel?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I apologise to you, Jane, if it's been confusing and quite hard to get your head around it. It is quite challenging to kind of balance those things. I don't think that the time that we need to take to review it should be an issue. We just need to make that happen if that's the direction that happens. But I guess from my perspective, there is some real subtleties around when, and I take your point that programming is a different issue. But if we know that there's some projects that are, almost good to go, and we're going to put some stuff that we know is programmed to be in this 7 to 8 years process, I think what that doesn't, just a bland list doesn't give you is that sense of how everything is interrelated and all the planning that's gone on within the TSP process. So it's that kind of subtlety that's quite challenging to articulate in such a kind of blunt thing as a list. Does that help?
I will withdraw my second of your motion. I'm sorry, Stephen.
Okay, I will get it on the table. I will second it pro forma. Okay, are there any further? Well, you've had your final say. We're going to now vote on scenario 4, increased weighting for integrated freight resilience, and the percentages are 25, 30, 15 and 30. All those in favour say aye. 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 Against? No. I'll call a division. All those in favour, raise your right hand. Those against? 3. David, did you vote?
Yeah.
Which way? Against, so that's 4, so it's lost. Okay, and I gave notice that I would put up scenario 1, the prioritised list of significant activities is consulted upon in the draft RLTP, and those being 25, 30, 10 and 35. Is there a seconder? Seconded, Deputy Mayor Donaldson. Any speakers for or against? There being none, I'll put it. All those in favour? This is scenario 1. I think we know it pretty well by now. We could set it to music, I think. Okay, I will put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carry it. I'll call a division. Raise your right hand. Those in support. And Commissioner Selwood voted against. Yes, correct. Okay. Okay, we now revert back to page 18, everybody. The recommendations there. I would just, with your indulgence, like to add a further one that we acknowledge the work and the contribution of the Regional Advisory Group. I think they were incredibly valuable through all of this. We talk so frequently about bringing a global and a Bay of Plenty perspective to these meetings, but I think those folk that party for that showed a huge degree of independent, now something's wrong with the description. Okay, with the addition of number 8, I will move it. Is there a seconder for all of those 1 to 8? Deputy Mayor Isles, I will put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Okay, moving on. And we go over to page 50. Regional Land Transport Plan deliberations. Lorraine, come up, grab a microphone.
I'll just.
Lorraine, James, are you leading this?
Yes, so Lorraine and I will do a bit of a double act. I'll give the presentation again. After each slide, we'll pause. I'll allow Lorraine to make any further comments that I've missed, because Lorraine has gone through the submissions in a level of detail that you wouldn't believe. And so it's really important that she gets an opportunity to clarify anything I say, which is at a much higher level. So the purpose of this presentation is not to go through every single submission point in detail. It is to try and provide a high-level summary of the key points and themes, and then to use that as the basis for a more detailed discussion as members wish. And like I say, I will pause after every slide in order to be able to field questions and comments. So contents again, so the story so far, some vital statistics from the consultation. So I think it's important just to set out some key evidence as to what we've actually done. As I said, the main thing is the key themes, messages in our recommendations, and then the next steps. So I again won an award for making the presentation unintelligible. So in essence, the story so far really revolves around the decision at the 19th of February RTC to go and adopt a special consultative procedure under the Local Government Act for going out to consultation under that piece of legislation. And in essence, the public consultation asked 4 specific questions around particular topics. So I will actually just read those to you because they're too small to read on the screen. So topic 1 was around the draft RLTP, aiming to shift the focus of the investment strategy to better provide for alternative modes of transport, buses, walking, cycling, and micromobility, and to move away from continued car dependency. So the question we asked was, do you think this is a positive shift? And what do you think the key priorities should be? So giving respondents an opportunity to understand that this investment strategy is perhaps quite different from ones they might have seen previously. So that was topic number 1. Topic number 2 went into more detail around climate change. So it noted that the impacts of climate change, such as extreme weather and sea level rise, pose a significant challenge to our region. I think most people would agree with that statement. The question was, do you think the draft RLTP does enough to support changing the way we travel, improve network resilience, provide more sustainable forms of transport, and assist in reducing emissions in order to contribute to our climate change responsibilities? So that was, again, very much putting climate change at front and centre and being explicit about its importance. Topic number 3 was more to do with the issue that we've just discussed, which is the prioritised list of activities. So it says that the draft RLTP includes a number of projects within the list of activities that aim to further utilise alternative modes of transport and mitigate the effects of climate change. And so we asked, do you think the list of activities will help to achieve those desires? That's actually a critical issue from a number of perspectives. And topic 4 was an invitation for other thoughts on the draft RLTP. And that shouldn't be seen as in any way downplaying the significance or the importance, because fundamentally this is a very broad-ranging document, and we are very interested in comments across a broad range of topics, and indeed we received comments on a broad range of topics. So the question was, do you have any other comments you'd like to make regarding the draft RLTP? And in particular, are there any transport opportunities we have missed or where there should have been more emphasis? So those were the 4 questions. And have you got anything to add, Lorraine, from your perspective?
I'm Lorraine Sheen, I'm senior planner in James's team. I just really wanted to take the opportunity at the outset to thank the submitters, because the submissions were of exceptional quality, and the RLTP is a really difficult document to engage on. And we had, which David's probably going through, we had in total 49 submissions, and around 32 of them came in on, 29 of them came in on that form, and then another 20 were written in whatever format they wanted, and again addressed whatever issues they felt relevant. So the submitters just covered a range of issues, and they really enabled us to interrogate the document that we did go out on consultation, and I believe have, although we haven't made extensive changes, they have enhanced the consultation document that we had. And just to note that of those 49 submissions, the 20 that came in free flow form, 12 of them were in support of the document, in general support, and made submissions on points. And then 20 of the 29 essentially answering that question 3 that James just read out. It's like, have we got the right activities and programs? After saying, yes, we like the investment strategy, have we got the right programs? So that is what we've spoken about through the process. It's the broad level of support for the investment strategies. And then of the ones who weren't supportive, it was a split between those who felt that the program and the document didn't go far enough, but addressing things like climate change, and then who felt that it went too far. So it's sort of like got a broad level of support, and then those that didn't support, we didn't seem to please either way. And so we've taken that as perhaps we might have landed somewhere, you might have landed somewhere in the middle with this document.
Well said, Lorraine, and James also. So are you now going to lead us through, starting on the bottom of page 52, on the submissions or seeking comments from panel members? Is that how we're going to go? We're going to go page by page, I understand.
Well, what we can do is either do that, or when we get to the specific slides, do that then. Perhaps just before we get into that, has anyone got any comments on the first series of slides about how the consultation happened and what we actually got through that process?
Councillor Needs.
Not a comment on the process, but just a acknowledgement and recognition of the amazing work that's being done by staff to summarise all of those submissions. I think it was very, very helpful to actually have them summarised in the way that they were, because it was actually quite difficult otherwise to get a helicopter view of what people were saying. So I just want to say thank you very much for a very good job on the submissions.
Through the chair, thank you, Councillor Nees. Lorraine has spent many days on this and has done an absolutely amazing job. I really appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Louise, do you want to move a formal resolution to that effect? I'm happy to second.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll put it, all those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. So you're going to lead us through some more of the presentation and then we'll come back to addressing the themes.
Yeah, so one of the things I just want to do is provide a very high-level overview of each theme and some key messages and high-level recommendations, but then we can go back to each of the themes and go through the specifics as we want to. So the first key theme was around healthy and safe people. So I've just pulled out three key messages. The first of those is all organisations should be aligned in a longer term Vision Zero approach. I'd be surprised and worried if that message didn't come through loud and clear. So I think that's really good. There was certainly an acknowledgement of a positive shift towards active transport, walking and cycling in particular. And that's really good because all of the different sub-regions, in my view, have got very positive proposals and stories to say around walking and cycling, as our colleagues in Whakatane, for example, have referred to earlier. So that's actually a really, really important point, that we are saying that pedestrians, cyclists, and now increasingly people on scooters have to have that greater level of priority and consideration within transport investment. And the last key message, again, no real surprise, is that there is a strong desire to have safe cycle routes for children. You know, cycling as a child has been seen for many years as a rite of passage. It's something you learn to do from an early age, and you use that as a means of exploring your world. Unfortunately, the dangers of increasing levels of traffic means that these days there are a lot more concerns around cycling for children, and it's really important that we invest to making that mode safer. So those are just three key messages, but we can discuss many others, I'm sure. On the right-hand side, we just summarise what are our main sort of recommendations. Again, we can go into the specifics on individual items as we wish. So the first one is we get quite a lot of comments about individual locations where people believe there are safety problems, or they can provide evidence there are safety problems. Now, it is the job of the Rrtp to prioritise and consider safety projects to meet the Vision Zero target. But fundamentally, where there are specific issues on the network and there's a specific proposal, that really has to be referred to the relevant road controlling authority to understand whether there's any action that needs to be taken now versus a longer term project. So we have to be mindful that if someone raises an issue, there's a way of ensuring that the relevant road controlling authority knows about it. The second broad recommendation is that improvement activities are often being included through low-cost, low-risk programs. So we spent quite a lot of time this morning talking about the prioritised list of significant activities, but it should be recognised that low-cost, low-risk programs actually for people in local areas are really, really important. It may only be one crossing that actually makes the difference between someone being able to access a facility and not. And these are the sorts of things that go under the radar, but actually are really, really important for particular groups of people. Now, the other recommendation, and this is something we're going to be discussing at Regional Transport Committee in a couple of weeks' time, is that speed management is included as a line item in the programme. So if you're not already aware, you certainly will be very soon, that a draft rule on local speed management has been issued by Waka Kotahi for consultation. And as part of that process, there is a recommendation that regional speed management plans are implemented and coordinated and led by the RTC. So at the moment, we don't know the significance of that level of work, although we think it will be high. And we don't know from a capital programme perspective how much proposals to implement speed management changes will be, but we suspect they could be quite high. So we've just included a line item to make it clear that it is something that has to be a really now big part of the healthy and safe people theme. So those are just my headline summaries. Lorraine, as the expert, the detailed assessor of all of this, please feel free to add anything else in before we take any questions.
So we're in your hands, Lorraine. How do you want to handle this?
I thought we would just go through.
Just pause a moment. Sorry, Councillor Neve.
Two things when I read your analysis that jumped out at me. One was a note that there was discrepancy between our targets in the Rrtp and the targets in the Road Policy Action Plan and the Road to Zero. And I guess that's picked up in your comment, all organisations should be aligned. I note in your analysis that you say our target is actually like a pro rata of, the 40% reduction in death and serious injuries by 2030 is like a pro rata of the 2050 target. I just wonder, just to clarify that in the document, could we have a footnote against that key performance indicator which says that this explains why this might differ from the zero by 2050 target, just to cover off that submission. And the other question that was asked is, could we have safety listed as a strategic intervention? Now, my view is that the strategic interventions are system level changes and that we'd be happy to do things completely different in the safety area to list it as a strategic intervention. I didn't see that picked up anywhere in your analysis. So I'm happy to leave it as not as a strategic intervention, but I just wondered whether you wanted to make a comment. It was submission 35.6 and it was on page 20 in this second paragraph.
Yeah. We have picked up safety as a strategic intervention, and that's we're recommending that some text be added in around that for that point. And with the pro rata use, we can do a footnote. And we provide some better explanation about that. Some of the inconsistencies are due to the timeframes of the documents and also the dates at which the various documents were prepared. So what was the relevant target and strategy at that time? So, as James has pointed out, we felt that essentially, even though the different documents are set to different times and they look slightly misaligned, we are all moving in the right direction, and our one is prorated to that Vision Zero. I just want to make the comment generally as we start, based around all of the things. As I said, that there were excellent submissions, and I wanted to capture as much of the material and the ideas that came through, even when people weren't suggesting changes or particular issues, so that each section as we go through in the submissions is talked to. We've noted all the ideas and then made a summary of where we've tried to enhance the text to recognise the points that have been made. but for all of the specific points under each theme where they would relate to an activity or a new line item, they are all, they're not listed under the theme, they're all put under the program or the activities list so that the committee has the opportunity to consider each one individually.
So just to be clear that you're adding in table 4, safety as a strategic intervention? You are. Oh, that's great, I missed that. That's excellent. So there's text that goes with that. Great, thank you.
So the submissions. We're going through them page by page.
Yeah, if that's what you want to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at the bottom of page 52, the healthy and safe people submission start. So any questions or comments from any members of the panel for pages 52 and 53? Being none, moving on. Environmental sustainability, commencing page 54 and 55.
So if you want me to, I've got some key messages here I can just run you quickly through.
Yes.
Yeah, so there were 2 key messages which, to be fair, Lorraine has already talked through, but I'll just repeat them again. So the first key message was that respondents generally felt the environmental narrative was balanced and positive, but as Lorraine highlighted, there were people who wanted less emphasis on climate change, and there were some who wanted more, and there were a lot in the middle who I think were pretty happy with the balance. But there are some recommendations that we feel strengthen the document, and they do relate to some of the submissions. So there was, I think rightly, some concern about the absence of the narrative around electric vehicles, and although that's not a panacea for climate change, it is certainly part of the policy mix, and we recognise that people will always drive, so it's far better if they drive in an electric vehicle than not. So we're certainly looking to strengthen that narrative, and Regional Council, along with all the other regional councils in the country, are rapidly now starting to think about bus decarbonisation and getting those diesel vehicles away from our network. So there's quite a lot I think we can do around that, just to strengthen the narrative in certain areas. I think there's also an opportunity to identify further opportunities to reduce freight vehicle emissions, because fundamentally, again, freight vehicles are going to remain with us. So for me, the opportunity is about how do we actually make those vehicles as environmentally friendly as possible. So, whether that is transferring road freight onto rail, or whether it's changing the vehicle type so that trucks are less environmentally damaging and emit fewer greenhouse gas emissions. Those are opportunities that I think we can sensibly refer to in the document, and there's certainly a lot of work that the port has been doing, for example, around looking at their carbon impact. So there should be actually quite a good story in amongst all of that lot. And the last one is that at some point, the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets will need to be reviewed. So we have a target in our Rrtp that we believe is appropriate for the investment narrative and the programme, but it won't surprise you to learn that given the climate emergency and given the targets to reduce emissions by 2030 even higher than previous, at some point emissions targets, I think across every organisation, are going to need to be reviewed to understand what more can be done. So that's not specific to the Rrtp, but it's something that we front and centre for all of our work. So those are the 3 recommendations, but again, happy to discuss those or anything more in detail.
Deputy Mayor Donaldson.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I like those recommendations. So just the narrative around electric vehicles will include the supporting infrastructure for electric vehicles, I take?
Oh yeah, it has to. I mean, that's one of the big issues in terms of uptake. I mean, certainly from the bus perspective, we know that we have depots that are not located in the right places for connection to the grid. So if we go down that process, we're going to have to find some better infrastructure. So yes, it will.
It can include through charging infrastructure.
Charging infrastructure, yeah. I mean, that's for me as a potential EV user of the future. That's what I'd want to know. I don't want to have confidence that I could charge the vehicle when I wanted to.
Councillor Lees.
Thank you. The sections where we first see the submissions on the difference between the urban reality and the rural reality, and that perhaps what might be an acceptable motive target for urban dwellers is not so easily achieved for rural dwellers. And I guess our KPIs are net figures, aren't they? They're across the region, whether or not people live in urban or rural environments. But I just wonder if we are planning to strengthen, well, I'd like to see us strengthen the narrative around the rural and the urban ability to make no shift adjustments. You know, we don't have the ability to run a frequent bus service in some of the rural areas as we can in the city. We have a lot of areas that actually don't even get a bus anywhere near them. So it's just about having some sort of narrative in there. I know it's possibly impossible to split our target to rural and urban for mode shift. I can't imagine how we'll possibly measure that and monitor it, but just to reflect the fact that what we have, our KPIs are in net across the region, and that it's easier. There are many different ways that we can get a mode shift and make sure that we're being environmentally friendly. So EVs may be the way that rural dwellers mitigate their carbon if they cannot get to public transport. So it's just some sort of commentary in the plan around that.
Deputy Mayor Isles.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just adding to Councillor Lee's conversation there, deprivation too in our more isolated rural communities would be worth noting as well.
Deputy Mayor Donaldson.
And again, referring to Councillor Lee's commentary and back to my original around supporting infrastructure, but I just note, you know, with the concern about rural connectivity, Aotearoa Bike Challenge, we have a staff member who lives 29 kilometres away who commuted by e-bike for the whole week, and you have a gentler climate over this side of the bay. So I think the community is waking up to what is possible as long as that's supporting infrastructure. And if you ride into council, plug the e-bike in and ride home, it's no problem.
James, we've got slides on inclusive access.
Certainly have, but sorry, Lorraine, far away.
Sorry, I just wanted to make one comment. Just need to point out that we went a little bit too far in accepting it is submission point RLTP 35.9. We accepted it, and it's around the rail emissions and using rail emissions and freight. When we went and put it in the document and did a read of the document, we just need to in the wording slightly. We're accepting the intent, but I think we might have been overcommitting the parties, and we actually created a contradiction further along in the document, so we just have to marry that up.
Clarifying that. Okay, inclusive access.
Yes, well, inclusive access actually addresses a lot of the points we've just discussed under the previous theme. So in terms of the key messages we received from the consultation, respondents wanted a stronger emphasis on access challenges in rural coastal areas, and I'll be the first to admit that, you know, the RLTP is, you know, heavily focused on our largest urban area, but I absolutely agree with respondents that a stronger emphasis on rural areas and coastal areas is important. This is a regional land transport plan at the end of the day. So I think it was always something that in the back of our minds, we suspected that people would say this, and they're right too as well. A key message was that more non-car access options are needed. So getting back to the point about deprivation, owning and running a car is not cheap, and there are a lot of people in our region who either can't afford to run a vehicle at all, or run it and see a lot of their hard-earned disappear into insurance and car maintenance and other things like that. So it certainly was a key message that non-car access options isn't just about mode shift for people who've got a car and need to use it less, which we've talked about a lot today, but also about the people who don't have that option at all. And I think that's an important point. In terms of a recommendation, so we want to strengthen the narrative around the challenges of road accessibility. I think that's really important. We discussed at the Public Transport Committee yesterday the need to identify and trial new public transport solutions that don't just assume that your standard 50-seat bus is going to be the thing that gets people access to where they need to get to all over the place. So, a lot of discussion around the on-demand public transport trials, small buses, all that sort of thing. So I think we can strengthen the narrative around that, and that's clearly something that Regional Council should be pursuing through the work of my team in particular. The last recommendation, I think, is a general comment, probably about everything we do. Not specific to Rrtp, but we do, I think, need to commit to genuine iwi engagement around transport aspirations and needs in communities. I'm very conscious that since I've come into this role, the Eastern Bay and bits of Rotorua in particular have probably not had enough of my attention as a person and as my team. And we've had a discussion as a team that we need to start out and getting out and doing more in that space and talking and listening to our communities. So I think if we can get that into the Rrtp, that gives us a mandate to do just that. So anything else to add, Lorraine, from your perspective?
Just pause a moment. Deputy Mayor Ryan.
Thank you, Chair. Could we add in there hapu as well with iwi, please? Thank you.
Back to you, James and Lorraine.
Yeah.
Is there anything to add? I think that's covered it.
We've got a slide on economic prosperity. Here we go.
Okay, so the key messages that we received on economic prosperity. So perhaps a surprising one, but perhaps not. So we certainly have strong business and industry support for a low carbon economy. The submissions we received were actually very positive, seeing low carbon as an opportunity and not as a threat. And I think that's down to a lot of good work that has been done by the likes of Priority One and also by companies in the region who have actually shown leadership in this space. So you'll be aware now that there's a greater Tauranga travel pledge where some of our major employers are committing to helping to reduce the single occupancy car travel of their commuters and their business needs. So it isn't the case that businesses are saying we don't think low carbon economy is good. Actually, the reverse is true. Another key message, which again we've talked about today, and I think we can agree with, is that there does need to be a greater emphasis on the importance of freight and freight issues because of the structure of the regional economy and the presence of one rather large port and some smaller port activities, being able to ensure that freight is able to move through well-connected multimodal hubs, and getting access to those ports is something we just need to make sure is very strongly reflected in the narrative, because it's key to a lot of the activity that happens in this part of the world. So some recommendations. So there is an opportunity to set out some more evidence of the economic benefits of climate change action. So if you go back to about 2005, Nicholas Stern produced a report which demonstrated how much of your GDP you would actually protect if you took action to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So it's something that hasn't gone away as an issue, and I think we can reflect some of the latest thinking to make the point that climate change is not antithetical to economic benefits. The two can actually coexist. Definitely a stronger emphasis on the priority freight movement corridors, and as we've discussed a number of times today, the role of personal mode transport mode shift in actually providing that space and capacity for the priority freight movement. So that's come through as a message, I think, very loud and clear. And ultimately linking transport investment to job creation in sustainable industries. So I'll give a plug for decarbonised buses. I believe that provides a really good opportunity for some existing businesses in this part of the world, and to develop a cluster of economic activity around low carbon buses, and that's something I'll certainly be looking to promote with colleagues through Priority 1. But again, it makes the point that we're about promoting a sustainable and modern economy. This isn't transport for transport's sake. So having, I think, some greater emphasis about that job creation in new industries and sustainable industries would be really important.
Commissioner Selwood, then David Spears. Commissioner Selwood, then Deputy Mayor Dawson. Commissioner Selwood.
Thank you, Chair. And I don't have any disagreement on that, but I do think what's missing from the recommendations is recognition of commercial trips. And I know that freight is often used as a proxy for commercial trips, but actually freight is only a very small proportion of total trips. Commerce is much more significant, and it needs to be recognised, I think.
David Spears, then Deputy Mayor Donaldson, then Councillor Neves. David.
So first of all, touch up at that point, because exactly right, commercial. I also just interested in whether there's potential here to draw a link to investment in housing. And just picking up Commissioner Selwood's point earlier, for example, there's some commentary around here around the location of Rangi Area Business Park, and the opportunity to have efficiently located employment land, drawing trips away from the congested city. But you kill two birds with one stone by thinking about where you put your housing and making sure the housing offering is appropriate to that location, so you don't have people driving from one end of the city to the other. And I think then you can draw, and it's not a long bow to then start drawing the impacts of reduced travel time and congestion on carbon emissions from freight, because frankly, great big trucks idling in a congested city versus great big trucks driving cleanly through a great big city is a no-brainer. So I think that should be reflected a little more strongly, and it gives a nod to that spatial planning around where we put our houses and the type of housing.
Deputy Mayor Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to endorse the comments around the message on business and industry support for a low carbon economy, and I think acknowledging they weren't necessarily submitted, but in Rrtp, that our Chamber of Commerce, and I see the revival of the Sustainable Business Charter, pushing those same messages that having a low carbon backstory to your enterprise is good for business. And so I think engagement with them as well, going forward, as well as Priority 1, but absolutely support that message.
Councillor Neves.
Thank you. There's quite a bit of commentary around rail starting to come through in this activity, in this theme. Since we developed the draft, Kiwi Rail has come out with the National Rail Plan, and also I've received advice at the UNISA meeting that there's a business case being developed for passenger rail between Hamilton and Tauranga. And I just wonder whether we shouldn't be checking those two things out and making appropriate reference to them in our document, if that is in fact the case. I do understand MB's been advised to do that business case. But as far as the rail plan, this is supposed to be a land transport plan, and if there are any projects in the national program that we need to be referencing, I think that's quite a good thing to do. The other theme in here was around tourism and making sure that we adequately reflect tourism routes and cycling as a tourism attractor. We did have a number of submitters who were talking about, we could in the Bay of Plenty be as big as Otago with our rail trails, etc. So I haven't had the chance to go back and have a look at the draft document, but I just wonder whether that also isn't something that could just have a little bit of strengthening.
Yeah, through the chair, it's probably worth making a couple of comments about those points because they're both very good ones. So Lorraine and I are both ex-Waka Kotahi employees, and our previous lives actually involved working in the transitional rail activity class at the time. So we are well across the rail network investment program that Kiwi Rail have put out. My understanding of the program is that it is primarily focused on improving the resilience of the existing asset through much greater levels of maintenance of track, signalling, permanent way and that sort of thing. And then where there is investment in additional capacity, it's limited primarily to Auckland and Wellington, to those well-used and very busy passenger rail networks. But having said that, as you rightly say, there is discussion at cabinet level at the moment around the potential of a passenger rail interregional service business case between Tauranga, Hamilton and ultimately Auckland. Both Namusa and myself have been down to Wellington to talk to the Ministry of Transport about that, and my understanding is that officials have made a recommendation to the Minister, who is now considering that. And so if we do get any positive noises before we submit the Rrtp, we can refer to that, or we can still refer to it but say that it's going to be subject to that MOT decision. So that, I think, deals with rail. On the tourism side of things, again, I think it's really important that we support our colleagues in Rotorua and Whakatane in particular, because in Rotorua's case, there's already a pretty solid cycle tourism offer and a pretty solid network. And Whakatane, through discussions with officers there, looking to promote cycle tourism, to take up the slack that's been caused by White Island and the issues there of one of the main tourist draw cards effectively now being off limits. So, yeah, I think it's actually a really important part of the narrative. We want people to come down here and visit, spend money in the economy, and we want them to do so in a sustainable manner.
Since we're on the home straight, resilience and security.
So here we go. Key message is, generally supportive of the overall strategy around resilience and security. But there is a diversion between some people who want more direct investments in resilience activities, but others that are concerned by the cost of those activities. And the key challenge we have with resilience is that we're investing for something that may or may not happen. Whereas normally with transport investment, you build something and you see, an immediate benefit of it. But resilience is very different because you invest in something and then hope that something never happens in terms of a catastrophe or something like that. And so some people say, we won't need to invest now because it will never happen, or only happen in 15 years, or there's only a 1 in 100 chance it will ever happen. So that's one of our key challenges, really, is to recognise that resilience is absolutely crucial, and that we do plan for events which may or may not occur, and look at the probabilities and the costs and the risks associated with it. So it is something I think that we find particularly challenging to try and articulate in an RLTP, but at the same time we recognise that this region is going to be significantly impacted by weather events, climate change events, and other types of hazards. In terms of recommendation, I think we can strengthen the strategic case and the narrative in the document to support network resilience at the right cost, whatever that might be, and to try and emphasise that we are investing very much as an insurance policy around trying to prevent things from happening. A lot of discussion at previous RTC workshops around identifying and emphasising the importance of multimodal alternative routes, and being able to sort of highlight those and work out what the best investment strategy for them actually is. And that leads to the next point, which is making a stronger link, between the climate change mitigation issues, which we've talked about an awful lot today, but also the adaptation to the climate change that is almost certainly going to happen. So those were the main messages and recommendations, and it's certainly one that I think we can, over time, for the next RLTP, I'd like to be perhaps more informed myself about how we actually better represent resilience as an issue in future investment strategies.
Any questions or comments to James? There being none, have you got a slide on the program generally? Oh, next steps.
Yeah, I think this is it. So I've had a nightmare with my dates, so I'm not going to claim that these are correct. So I'll just go through them and see if I can actually work out what the hell they are. Well, today, at least we've got that one right. The discussion of the individual submissions and subcommittee recommendations. So clearly we want to, first and foremost, make sure that we can do that. Now, the next one is an issue because theoretically, we can really only make amendments to the final RLTP document up to the 1st of June, because that's when the papers need to go out for the meeting on the 9th. So the 1st of June is a Tuesday, so that's next Tuesday. So it doesn't give us very long. So I would like to try and have a discussion about how we accommodate amendments and do them justice, whilst giving ourselves enough time to do them properly. So perhaps we'll come back to that towards the end in terms of the process. So it's an RTC meeting is the 9th of June. The actual reports and agenda, as I said, need to be on the 1st of June. So that's the RTC meeting where we hopefully will adopt the RLTP for progressing to regional council. So I understand, Amanda, if I'm right, that the date for adoption of the RLTP by regional council is now 24th of June. Oh, got that one right. And then submission of the document to Waka Kotahi is the 30th of June. And that is a hard and fast deadline. There is no room for change to that. So I understand the publication of the National Land Transport Plan will take place in August. And then essentially what we need to start doing is to update and deliver the Rrtp programme for both the Regional Transport Committee and indeed the regional and transport plan itself. I've already alluded to the speed management work that's coming our way. So that's something we can discuss on the 9th of June. And then the final slide, I'm not joking, we need to start preparing for the next Rrtp, because if there's one thing I have learned, it takes about twice as long as you think it should, and it's a continuous program of activity, learning, and we've only got 3 years. It's amazing how quickly that goes. So I'd certainly like, firstly, to undertake a lessons learned review internally within Regional Council with the RAG, and then come back to a future RTC meeting with some recommendations about what we can do differently in the future. I think everyone would welcome that one. So that's basically it in terms of next steps. So yeah, for me the key issue is just making sure we've got the practicalities around amendments to the final document and how we deal with that and get it right first time.
Thanks, James. Before we deal with the recommendations, some final comments from you, Nahuta.
I think staff have summarised it well in terms of where we're going and those critical next steps. As James said, the 9th of June, our regional transport, your upcoming regional transport committee meeting is going to be critical because given the short time frames that we're working within. So
I just ask you to go back to page 51 in your hard copies. 4 recommendations there. Councillor Lees, you happy to move?
Yes, I am.
Commission.
I do have a question too, though. So. Oh, my question is, if we pass our resolutions today, we won't see how they've been reflected in the document. So will this subcommittee get a chance to have a look at the draft before it goes out on the agenda, or will that be the first time we get to see it? Because it should be reflecting our direction. I would hate it to get to the table and then we decide that.
Go through the scenarios all over again. Bring some clarity to this, Lorraine.
For you, Mr. Chair, I'll try. I think the biggest risk was how decision was made around prioritisation. We have captured all of the changes that would be made if you made decisions that you've made. However, it does need to go out on the agenda on Tuesday, and there's really no practical time to release anything before that, but that will be the mock-up version. And we can still deal with feedback that you have, but it will have to be addressed at the meeting to change the document.
perhaps just to add, so if you're comfortable with the recommendations within the report, they make the bulk of the changes, plus the additional comments that we've had today, which staff as well as Amanda have been capturing, and we can reiterate those just to reconfirm, if that would be useful, so that we're really clear in terms of what it is you're approving.
That would be great.
Okay, it's been moved. Deputy Mayor Donaldson, you happy to second? It's been seconded. I've got the recommendations 1 to 4. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. Before I close the meeting, can I just acknowledge, subject to the following amendments. Okay, yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I think I'm going to go through the actual recommendations. Start from page, that's the request for new activities, starting from page 41. Are we just accepting all of those and all the other matters and the language and text corrections? Staff going to address those? Oh, sorry, I was reading off the old agenda. We have a section on starting from 1.8, which has got a whole lot of sort of more detailed staff recommendations. Are we going to work through those?
Help me out here.
So we're on page
74.
Page 74 of the agendas. New activity requests.
Was the intention that we were going to look at those?
Well, this is your meeting, so yes, we're absolutely happy if you wish to go through anything in terms of the submission process. So, yeah, we can more than happily do that.
Sorry, Mr Chair, I don't want to stand on the words, but I had a couple of questions.
It's okay, you go for it.
Okay, all right. So starting on page, and I'm really sorry because I did all my notes on the old version, so section 1.8. Sorry, going on to, there's a request for the Mokoroa structure plan to be included, and I didn't understand what the staff meant by except in part. So this is one of the Western Bay recommendations. They wanted an additional bullet point in the text. Has that been included or not?
Bottom of page 75, submitted number RRTP 15. Yeah.
Through you, Mr Chair, except as part is these are activities where they've been brought forward after the prioritisation, so we can't include them in the prioritised list, but we are saying for all of those activities where we have been given the undertaking that the relevant territorial authority is including them in their LTP planning process, so they are providing funding for them. We are putting them in, we're recommending that they go into the RLTP unprioritised.
Unprioritised, that's great. So will that also flow for the other submissions that we've had, like the Pikitahi Bridge and the second landing bridge road? I know we're adding Katikati bypass in as a prioritised but not funded activity, but these were submitted on as they have been BRLTP since I've been sitting on this committee, and yet no progress happens for those, and we've had submissions again this time. So are we planning to reflect those anywhere in the document, those Eastern Bay projects?
So I want to say at this point, it was really nice that you gave the vote of thanks before, but I also want to recognise our colleague Andrew Williams, who worked really, really hard on the RLTP through the process and just wasn't able to work on the final stages, and that did leave me picking up the consideration of the activities, and I have to confess I didn't know where some of them were. I have spent a lot of time on Google trying to find out about some of the new activities that we had no information on, and so I may have made a few errors. I've tried to check them with the extra time that we had, but in general what I have done with all of the activities where the TAs have been able to, as I said, go indicate that they've got funding or seeking funding for an activity, then to have it in the plan is in the plan but not prioritised. The second way is a bit relates to Waka Kotahi and or one of the territorial authorities, and it falls under the 2 million or another program. Then the idea is to pick them all up, and the RTC would then send them to them for their consideration in those programs and through their own internal processes. And I just can't remember the detail around the Pikitahi Bridge. I remember finding it and I remember making a recommendation, but if you could point it out to me and I read what I said, I will be able to tell you why.
Yeah, no, I think you said that you've referred to Waka Kotahi.
So it must be on a state highway network, or it is, yes.
Yes, so I mean, I think that's what we've done every year, every time, and nothing has happened. I just wanted to wonder whether it needs to be reflected in the document in some way.
So those activities go into a table that is the RTC specifically requested for Waka Kotahi. Yeah. That's probably the most that we can do at this stage.
Unless the alternative is to, under resilience, just note that there have been requests for resilience projects on the State Highway Network we haven't been able to reflect within the document. For example, the Landing Road, a second Landing Road bridge, and the Pikitahi Bridge, 2 laning, is it 2 laning? No, it's 1 lane, 2 lane. Yeah. So maybe that we can cover it off just by having a little text note somewhere.
David, then Deputy Mayor Isles, David.
Andrew might have been going on this question anyway. That question. So there's two processes. One, National Land Transport Plan for the big projects, state highway projects, etc. So exactly what's just been described, they will go into that list and get stacked up against everything else, of which there are a lot. And then the other one is the low risk, low cost, low risk program, which is that sub $2 million. And again, they get stacked up against the whole list of priorities. So those really are the only two options for those projects.
Deputy Mayor Isles.
Just an added note there too, Mr Chairman, in regards to Pikitahi Bridge, that is work that has been done in consultation with local iwi, and there's quite a sensitive topic. There seems to be a resistance to a 2-lane bridge at the Pikitahi because of the traffic implications through the residential town of Taneatua. So it's a subject that each time it's broached, we recommend that it go back to iwi for consultation before we even progress it.
Councillor Lee, here's another submission.
I'll back down on that, Mr Chair. Just moving on to 2.9.3, non-Rrtp matters. And there's a comment there about stock effluent disposal facilities. You won't be aware, but this has been something that this committee's talked about. And there was for the last 2 Rrtps, and it has been on the regional council books as a project, but has not been progressed as far as I was aware. So Federated Farmers have submitted on this. I would like to think that it's somewhere in our program. I don't think we've got another stock effluent disposal facility yet. As far as I'm aware, there was one supposed to be put in the Western Bay because of the effluent that was spilling on the Kamas, and it was not safe. So particularly this time last triennium, we were having that discussion. So I just was a flag for me to remind myself what is happening about stock effluent treatment. Does it drop completely off the program as far as the regional council is concerned and off the list altogether?
Through you, Chair, I had undertook that this would be addressed through the discharges plan that the regional council has, rather than being a Rrtp activity, but I can confirm that that would be the way to take it forward.
It was a program, it was in the plan, or it was programmed previously. So we just...
Sure, the chair will look into it and get back to you.
Mind.
So straight to that one.
Any other submissions, Councillor Lees?
No, lots of ticks. Just give me 2 seconds. There's a submission 35.8
who asks for changing in wording to provide for safe and reliable journeys for people and freight and enable quality urban development and plan growth areas. You've rejected that comment and said no, it doesn't enable quality development and planned growth areas, it supports it. I just wonder whether we can't add those words with support instead of enable. I'm sorry, I can't tell you what number it is.
It's on 88.
Page 88.
88. So just change the text that's recommended and support quality urban development instead of enable.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, that sounds like a good suggestion.
That's it, thank you.
Okay, back to page 51 again, going backwards. Okay, the recommendations have been moved and seconded, 1 to 4. I'll put them. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. I believe that's the end of the meeting.
One of the recommendations, recommendation 2 is get.
Yes,
Do you
yes.
want to just leave what those are, be approved, or?
Or just give you licence to, you've heard them.
Yep, either or.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, before I declare the meeting closed, I'd just like to thank you, Amanda, for all the work you've put into this, and to the staff generally, James, you and your team, Lorraine, everybody else, and in particular the panel members, but Commissioner Selwood, you in particular, I can't tell you how refreshing it is to have you in Tauranga with your vision and the exemplary way that you participate in all our meetings. So Tauranga is very lucky to have you, believe you me. Okay, on that note, I'll close the meeting. Lunch for the panels downstairs, and I think